Hello, so this video aims to explain the setup description of our nPro project, as well as expose the results. So first, Dorian is going to start with the setup description, and then I'm going to continue with an analysis of the results.
The district is located in the heart of Copenhagen, is comprised of a block of 71 buildings, all connected with one heat pip. We want to have a diversified district so that it could represent better a real world block. So we put a retail store, a museum, a church, 3 offices, 3 restaurants, and 1 convenience store. The rest is residential. In result, we can see the heating demand profile of our district. It quite logical that heat demand is up to 50 times lower in summer than in winter. This is due to Denmark being a cold country, so during the winter, heat demand will be much higher than in warmer country. Regarding electricity, the demand is also lower in summer but to a less extent than heat because electrical apparatus still need to be used as often as winter. The decrease can be associated to reasons like lower lighting and electrical heating use. In the energy hub section, we can see the technology we choose, so the gas and biomass CHP, the electricity grid, PV, distributing, heat pump, battery, heat storage, and heat and electricity demand. We also modify some parameters. First, the maximum area of PV panel was set to about 15% of the area of the district because that is the statistic we found online from Denmark. All reference can be found in the reference document. Regarding the heat storage capacity, we found a fact sheet giving usual heat storage size and assume half of the building up for one. This gave a reasonable size of 200 cubic meter, which is equivalent to a 10 by 10 by 2 meter room, which seems as a modest size for a 70 building district like ours. There weren't a lot of statistics for battery capacity. So for those, we choose 175 kilowatt hour by assuming 25% of buildings have a 25 kilowatt hour battery. This was based on the price of such battery that were found online. We want to be realistic and not put big and costly battery in every building. We found monthly price for 223, so we upload a grid electricity cost profile ourselves. For grid fin, source said that fin-in was set to €0 in Denmark, but we still choose 1 cent euro per kilowatt hour to see the economical impact of it in. Regarding the price for natural gas, biomass, and distributing, we found statistics, but they weren't as detailed as the grid electricity price. So we set an average value for the whole year. We also set a tax on CO2 of €50 per ton based on statistics found from Denmark. Thank you.
Okay, so let's now move on to the fourth scenario. So for this one, we wanted to study more specifically the impact on the price in the case the district would fully opt for renewables and minimize emissions. So to do this, we first restricted the import from the grid by limiting it to less than the scenario which imports the least. And we also entirely removed the district heating imports. We then increased the maximum PV installation area to be 20,000 meters squared so that it could cover the roof of every building. We also added fuel cells and electrolyzers and set them to a reasonable 15% of the PV production. And so finally, we added H2 storage and we set the limit to 30 kilograms, which equates approximately to 330 meters cubed. And we chose this size because a 10 meter by 10 meter by 3 meter storage seemed reasonable for a small district like ours, and the same for heat storage. Alright, so let's have a look at the scenario comparison and the results. So this first graph shows the levelized cost of heat versus the specific CO2 emissions. And we can see quite logically that our fourth scenario produces less CO2 than the second scenario, which is logical because we forced the use of renewables in the fourth one. However, it is also the scenario that produces the most expensive heat, and this is simply because this scenario uses the most expensive technologies. Then if we look at the minimum cost and minimum grid scenarios, we can see they are really close in cost of heat and CO2 emissions, And this is because the technology dimensioning of these two scenarios is almost the same, because the minimum cost scenario already almost doesn't use a grid. Then the second graph shows basically the same information, except it puts a line where the total annual cost is 0, which is the line of profitability. And in this case, we can see that the annual cost for scenario 1 and 3 are negative, which means that the energy cost, savings, and grid feed-in is enough to finance this transition and even to create some profit. However, this is in the case where the feed-in price is minimal, but most importantly, not non-zero, which is not the case this year in Denmark. Then on the energy import table, we can see that scenario 4 produces twice as much renewables as scenario 2, and the other scenarios don't use renewables because it's more expensive than alternatives. Interestingly enough, scenario 2 imports the most from the grid because it's one of the cleanest options if we look at the cheap energy options. We can also see that biomass is the major energy source in each scenario because it's a relatively cheap and clean source. And for the feed-in table, we can see that scenario 4 feeds in twice as much as scenario 2, while the two other feed in much less. The amount of feed-in is proportional to the area of PVs installed because they indeed produce more electricity than needed around noon, which will then need to be fed into the grid. Let's now move on to the energy hub section. So we can see that gas CHP is never used because of its high capex, but also because of its high opex. So natural gas indeed costs 3 times as much as biomass. Additionally, it generates more CO2 than the other technologies. Biomass CHP is used most in scenario 2 because it generates less CO2 than natural gas. We can see that the biomass CHP power in scenarios 2 and 4 is much higher because of the high dependence on renewables. And so we indeed need much more power from the other technologies when the PV panels are not producing in order to satisfy the demand. So PVs are only used in scenarios 2 and 4 because these are the ones that push the use of renewables. And for scenario 1, for example, they are not used because there isn't much irradiation in Denmark, so they would be less economical. It's also worth noting that when their use is forced, they are used at full potential as they are the cheapest option out of the available renewable energy technologies. We can then see on these two tables that the fuel cell that was installed contributed to 70 out of the 511 megawatt hours of electricity demand, which is only a fraction of about 13%. The heat pump has the same order of magnitude for heat generation and electricity demand between all scenarios. However, as I just explained, the power of the heat pump is 10 times much higher for scenarios 2 and 4 because of the big reliance on PV panels, which don't produce much in the morning or in the evening. And this highlights one of the shortcomings of PV energy. Then heat storage is used in every scenario, but is only fully used in scenario 2 and 4 because it allows to reduce CO2 consumption. And for batteries, they are not used in scenario 1 and 3 because it is less expensive importing electricity from the grid rather than investing in batteries and storing electricity. If we now move on to the economics, we can see on this first histogram that scenario 1 and 3 require small investments, while 2 and 4 require much more. And this is notably because of the high heat pump powers required, because of the substantial use of PV, and this can be seen in the investment. So if we go down to the lump sum cost, so these correspond to the upfront investment that has to be paid, and this table shows that scenario 4 is the one that requires the most upfront cash, which could be hard to achieve depending on the investors. If we go back up on the second graph, we can see that scenario 1 and 3 break even after 4 years, whereas scenarios 2 and 4 break even after approximately 25 and 35 years. And as this is longer than the lifetime of the panels, these entire projects would not be profitable and would only serve to reduce CO2 emissions. Then, even though scenarios 2 and 4 are not profitable, it's worth noting that each of the scenarios gets approximately 1 million euros in revenues. And if we examine this number, we can see that even though feed-in revenue is between 25 and 100 times higher in scenario 2 and 4, it's a negligible fraction of the total revenue. And finally, biomass constitutes the biggest expense in scenarios 1 and 3, and scenario 2 has the lowest energy cost as it does not rely on combustible fuels that cost money. So, to conclude this analysis, scenario 4 aims to force the use of renewables by adding new renewable technologies, by removing CO2 emitting ones, and by minimizing the grid imports. The effect of this was to increase the cost, but also to reduce emissions, giving a similar emissions versus cost outcome. An important highlight is that the main challenge linked to PVs is that they are not producing much in the morning nor in the evening, and this is where the energy peaks are at. And the consequences of this is needing heat pumps 10 times more powerful to accommodate for the lack of production during those times. And this in turn increases the the cost of this scenario by more than 10 times. And this is only one of the challenges of the energy transition of individual districts.